All right, thanks very much, Peter. Our next speaker is Bob Simons. Bob joined Dialog in 1981 and served as general counsel for 17 years. Because of Dialog's unique data access requirements, his activities range from developing database license agreements to serving as Dialog's liaison to the Information Industry Association. Simons also testified before government committees and panels in the US, Europe, and Asia about the value of information to the emerging institutions that were able to benefit from online research. He currently provides legal guidance and advice to the pathology imaging products team of Leica Biosystems, a division of the Leica microscope company. Take it away, Bob.
Thank you. I might mention that this is I work for Leica as a contractor. This is kind of my retirement. It gives me something to do during the day. Otherwise, General Hospital is only on for 1 hour.
I assume this was your office at Dialog in the picture?
Gee, I don't think so. My desk table is much more cluttered than that. You ever been in a lawyer's office? Oh, it looks like that before the lawyers moved in. After that, forget it. Roger mentioned one of the key milestones in Dialog's history, which was 1972, commercial. The next major milestone was in 1981, as the business was growing, and that's when I joined. Although I joined actually after the spin-out, but I was in contact with Roger during the spin-out. I was actually talking with the Lockheed management and the legal team there because I wanted to join the company. The problem I had was that I was working for a small service company in Santa Clara, whose major claim to fame was they were running the Viking mission Mars for JPL and NASA. And so I and they were being sold. One of the major service organizations at the time was Control Data, and Control Data just couldn't compete with this any company in Santa Clara. And so the only way they could compete with them was technically to buy them out. And so what I told Roger was that I can't join as early as June when the spin-out was actually occurring, but if you can wait a couple months, I felt there was a moral and ethical obligation for me to see the sale through to CDC. And I knew my future wasn't going to be with CDC because no way in hell had I moved from Chicago to California only to go back to Minnesota. That wasn't going to happen. So, but I know a lot about what happened in the spin-out because I was talking to the folks and I had copies of the documents after the fact and stuff. Roger mentioned that Dialog was actually created as a project within Lockheed Missiles and Space Company, not Mother Lockheed or Lockheed Aircraft Corporation at the time down in Burbank. And some of the reasons for the spin-off were pretty obvious at the time. First of all, it was a going concern, it was profitable, and it was one of only two commercial projects within LMSC. The other one was a little small company called JetPlan that actually used some Lockheed applications to create literally jet flight plans for commercial private pilots and commercial charter companies and stuff. But it was a much smaller company than we. But LMSC only had two commercial companies at the time. So some of the reasons they decided to spin it out as a separate corporation. One was that LMSC had a little bit of difficulty in accounting for Dialog and for JetPlan, who they spun out later as well, because LMSC, if you think about it, those of you who were around here in the 60s and 70s and 80s, they were the largest employer in the Valley, and all of their contracts were cost-plus contracts. They were developing weaponry and other military stuff for the armed forces, and so everything was subject to cost accounting standards and all that stuff. And they didn't really understand the commercial environment that well, and so we were unique in that context. So it simplified the accounting for it to spin us out and let us account for ourselves and stuff. The other thing is that it did create a corporate wall. If you remember the early days of LMSC and even today, most of their employee staff is represented. And the only, to my knowledge, the only represented employees in Silicon Valley are the bus drivers that go pick up people that are coming down to Google and other companies. here. But generally speaking, software folks, and the Waz is here, will probably tell you about that too. They don't want to join a union just to write code, for the most part. So creating a corporate wall between us and LMSC helped us to prevent any problems like that. And it was a good idea to create a self-contained entity because at the end of the day, Lockheed was not really a commercial company per se, and they always had this vision of maybe growing these companies that they're developing and sell them. And there's a rule of thumb that basically says that if you have 5 years of audited results, you've got a great story to tell, assuming the audited results are great. And our results were always great. So the 5-year concept made a very, very good thing to do. But let's start it off by creating our own corporation. And but it presented a number of issues, as you can imagine, because we were part of LMSC. So one issue was maybe there are employees that would prefer to stay with LMSC as opposed to go with Dialog. And my recollection is that there were a couple, but not many. Everybody really liked our enterprise and what was going on there. And besides which, the facility that Roger talked about in Palo Alto was a beautiful facility compared to driving into Lockheed in Sunnyvale, where most of you have driven past there, if not in there. But they did give people the option to come back, which is very, very good. It also meant that we were to establish our own organization, and that included all of the services that Lockheed LMSC had provided to us, everything from human resources to the law department function, and that's why I was hired to create that, to even building maintenance and so on and so forth. Administration, we had to create all of our own internal organizations. We also had to innovate and assign all of the contracts with customers and our database producers, because that had all been in the name of LMSC. So we had to convince all of database producers that we're going to assign and innovate those contracts from LMSC to this new Dialog entity, Dialog Information Services Inc. And of course, they were all making money on it, so they figured, yeah, we'll go along with that. So we didn't have any real problems along those lines. And like most startups today, we had to create our own operating policies and procedures. Well, the easy part of that was the fact that being part of LMSC, as you can imagine, as a government contractor, LMSC had just a plethora of policies and procedures covering anything and everything. And so we were like on second base and scoring position in that regard. So we started out with the LMSC policies and procedures, and Roger formed a small task force that I was one of the people in the group. And we went through all the LMSC policies, and we said, do we need this policy? Anybody building submarines here? No? Okay, we don't need that policy. We threw that out, and then we would change these and tweak them to reflect the technology company and stuff.
Bob,
Yes?
let me mention one other thing that just occurred to me. I defined a profit sharing system for Dialog within Lockheed. It was the first and only, and probably still the only one that exists. And that profit sharing was another incentive that employees had to join a new company.
And that was also a reason why they wanted a corporate wall, because they were afraid the unions were going to say, profit sharing. Yeah, interesting idea. Okay, so the final step in that process, other than the party we had the company had to celebrate the spin-out, was that LMSC and Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, which was headquartered out of Burbank, they developed something called a transfer agreement. It was like a typical buy-sell agreement that you may have stumbled upon. If you ever see those huge books in lawyers' offices that talk about the acquisition of shares of blah, 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 they're always like about this. In fact, I have the one where they sold us a Knight Ridder. I still have that, and it's about that thick. And I just moved, and it's one of those few things I decided not to throw out. You never know when you might want to make reference to it. But they created a transfer agreement that was about maybe only about 75 pages long. And what they really did is LMSC transferred the assets of Dialog to Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. So all of a sudden our reporting structure changed, where instead of reporting to the folks here in Sunnyvale, we were reporting to the folks who at that time were still in Burbank under Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. Eventually they changed their corporate trade name to Lockheed Corp, and they also moved out to Calabasas, out in the suburbs in the West Valley. But at that time we began to report to Lockheed. So we were a separate corporation at that point. We were on our own, and we started that growth spurt that happened in the 80s. And About 5 years later, Lockheed started to think, well, company's doing pretty well, and Roger showed you where that inflection point was, where things seemed to cross for a time. And at that point, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation really only had one commercial product at the time. That was the L-1011. Some of you ever hear fly an L-1011 or in the old days and stuff? Sure was, did. The problem with the there were several problems with the L-1011, but the biggest problem was the fact that, timing is everything. And the timing for building a huge jumbo jet in the late 70s and early 80s was like starting a business, in 1929. It just was the wrong time. For those of us who, looks like a few folks not many millennials in this room, but a few folks might remember the 70s when inflation was off the charts. There was very little fuel around, and there were lines to get gasoline. The cost of fuel was going up unbelievably and stuff. And because of inflation, because of the fuel prices, the major air carriers were cutting back on purchasing new planes at the time, especially the jumbos. And so this was the business that Lockheed was in up to its eyebrows insofar as its commercial business was concerned. And it was just bad timing. And for a time in 81, after they spun us out, they even thought for a moment, maybe we should sell Dialog now. But as it turns out, they decided to fold the tent on the L-1011, which is kind of a shame. I kind of enjoyed that plane. I know pilots. I spoke to a couple of pilots who liked to fly it as well. I had a lot of military bells and whistles on it and stuff that they really liked a lot. So, and a lot of pilots come out of the military. So, but be that as it may, Dialog was spun out, and we started our own corporation. We finished up all of the adoption of policies, and those of us here will remember what we call Dialog operating policies, or DOPS. We all had our big binder full of DOPS, and so no matter what came up, we could turn to a particular page and say, aha, this problem is covered on section 8, page 25, and we'll solve our problem that way. So
Bob, on the next slide here, there's a lot of interesting stuff about the Goldman Sachs auction.
Oh yes. So that was our next major. Enterprise event, which was in 1987, when Lockheed said, the time is right. Let's go ahead and sell Dialog now. So a couple of things happened that were kind of interesting and unique. One was that Roger and I were talking to Lockheed management at the time, and we came to an agreement where they would allow us to write the buy-sell agreement. Now, this is unique in the sense, if you think of, I don't know how many of you have been involved in M&A activities, but we've all bought or sold a home, or most of us have. This was like you have a willing seller of a house, you have a willing buyer of a house, and normally the seller prepares the contract. In this case, the house wrote the contract. So we wrote our own contract to be sold, which was very unique. And there were a couple of really good reasons for that. One is that Lockheed's main law firm was O'Melveny & Myers in LA. They didn't have a lot of clients in Silicon Valley at the time frame, but they were a real high-grade law firm, and they charged high-grade law firm rates. So it was going to be extraordinarily expensive. Well, I could save a lot of money. I'll write the buy-sell agreement, and I'm coordinating with the Lockheed Associate Counsel, so we'll do that, and a little help from our little boutique law firm here in the Valley, and we would write our own contract. Also, I wasn't convinced, and Roger wasn't convinced, and we convinced Lockheed that O'Melveny & Myers, they're not doing business up here in Silicon Valley, and we're a Silicon Valley company. We've got a lot of bells and whistles here, and they need to be cognizant of it and all that stuff. So if we write the contract, we know what those bells and whistles are. We can write a much more Dialog-specific type of agreement.
I think that kind of laid the groundwork for the auction approach.
Yes.
You can see how that segues in there.
Exactly. And we can represent the uniqueness of it. So what happened was that Lockheed had an investment banker, Goldman Sachs, and they brought Goldman Sachs on board. And they had a very unique approach toward the sale. And we like to call it an auction. So the first thing they did is they went out and they qualified companies who would be interested in possibly acquiring Dialog. Roger had some input to that process because there were certain companies we weren't too thrilled about, and we didn't want them to be tire kickers because we thought they may not be honest tire kickers.
they may want to come in and just look at our books, figure out what we're doing, figure out what our profit is, and then go back to their respective corners and compete with us even more aggressively. So, but the approach that was taken, the auction approach, which was really interesting. What they had us do was prepare a lot of our materials that would normally be found in schedules and exhibits in a buy-sell agreement. They had us do a lot of that up front, so that all we'd have to do at the tail end, when they finally had a buyer, is update that stuff. So that was one thing. The other thing was that we would have the typical types of dog and pony shows where key management comes in and presents, here's what we're doing in the company, here's what we're doing in my division, so on and so forth, explain the business, explain the products, and this stuff. And instead of just doing that and then going away, the auction had us split out into working groups. So that myself, for example, the CFO, met with the CFOs and the legal people from each of the tire kickers. And so we would do about 80% of the due diligence right then and there over like a 2 or 3 day period. And then that was that. They'd have a chance to do a little more due diligence down the road if they were the successful bidder, but most of it was done up front.
Can you tell us about the number of companies, how it was whittled down, and finally how many companies actually did it?
Yeah, I think we started out with, I think the initial interest was a little less than a dozen. And if I recall correctly, I think we wound up doing dog and pony shows to about 5 or 6, somewhere in that vicinity. A couple of them were added later because they just insisted on it, and Roger finally came around to seeing that there were a couple of opportunities here. But I think in all, somewhere between 6 and 8, I think, is the final number. I don't remember.
So is it 6 to 8 were actually bid, or how many bids were actually received?
I think it was about five bids.
About half a dozen,
Yeah, 5 or 6 bids were actually received. But part of that auction process, it was an all sales process, and Goldman Sachs and the investment banker they had, Roger and I will never forget his name, Tiger Sykes. This young fella was a salesman, and I know that he was just kicking every one of those tire kickers and saying, well, what kind of range are you thinking of? And when they would expose the range, Tiger would say, oh, you might as well drop out now because that ain't going to cut it. So that was the way he kept increasing the price, increasing the value. And at the very, and because we had written the contract, we sent that out to each of the finalists. And the rule was, there'll be no negotiations after the bids are in. If you have any exceptions you want to take to the contract, include those with your number when you submit your bid. So that really required them. It separated the men from the boys, if you will, and only those that were really, really interested in buying the company were going to invest that time and energy to look at the contract and go through all the details.
So who was the final winner for that?
The final winner was Knight Ridder, who surprised all of us. Quite honestly, they were the newspaper company. At the time, they were headquartered in Miami at their Miami Herald headquarters. You might recall that Knight Ridder had a big argument with San Jose when they moved here to San Jose to put their logo up on top of the building, and that was Tony Ritter's baby, so he wanted to do that. So, but Roger and I were there in Calabasas at that time when they opened the envelope and told us who the top bidder was and the price, and it was public record at the time. It was $353 million, and in 1988, that was a lot of money. That was a lot of money in those days. $353 million. That was probably pretty close to maybe a 30% premium on what Lockheed CFO thought they were going to get from the company. So they were very happy, and there are a lot of reasons why it all worked out very well. But the bottom line was that they were a surprise to us. We didn't, because they weren't really. They've experimented in online information, but they hadn't been real successful. But the chairman of the board of Knight Ridder had this vision that said, newspapers are eventually going to go online, and why not buy the industry leader right off the bat and give us a leg up. So part of the things that we were able to talk about during the Dog and Pony Show in particular, some of these unique things. And I think most of us, particularly in management, were very, very proud of. Domestically, even in 1987, when we were going through this divestiture, over half of our employee base was women. I always felt very, very good about that, being an early feminist, and over half of that group were managers. Now, a lot of it comes out of the fact that there were a lot of librarians, and traditionally that had been more of a woman's job than a man's job, but it made no difference. I mean, it still created a wonderful environment within Dialog in the enterprise. I felt it was a wonderful environment. And we had quite a few minority employees at the time, which, nowadays they're always talking about diversity. But I thought we were a very diverse company in the 80s. There's no question about it. The other thing we were all very proud of was the fact that we really had a highly educated workforce. Over almost 2/3 of the folks had either a bachelor's or master's degree, as you can see, and quite a few had doctorates or the equivalent, and that was pretty significant. And we had very, very, very little turnover every year. The enterprise was a fun place. It was a fun place to work. There was a certain esprit de corps that probably was only matched in the later years by Apple. But we were having parties long before Apple started having parties. But it was a great place to work. And one of the things that I think was a hallmark of Dialog was the fact that senior management was required, not requested, but required to spend a certain amount of time down in the customer services area. I think Peter had mentioned that one of the key attributes that made Dialog such a great enterprise was our service. And our customer service organization was absolutely top rate. I think it was the best in the world at the time. Nobody was offshore. They were all right there in Palo Alto, and eventually in Mountain View when we moved to Mountain View. And I remember spending quite a few hours with Sophie over here because I was interested in listening. Sophie was our patent specialist, so I would sit next to her with a headset on, hear the customers calling in, and hear the kind of questions they asked and the kind of answers she gave. And it gave everybody in senior management who did these things, gave us a real good feel for what are the customers asking, what do they want to do, how are we responding to them and stuff. And it was just a fabulous place to work and live, and indeed it was almost more fun going to work than it was being home for the most part. And not just because of the facilities, but just because of all the things that went on and stuff. So it was a great period and just a great amount of fun.
Thank you very much, Bob.